One day you finally knew what you had to do and began, though the voices around you kept shouting their bad advice. The whole house began to tremble and you felt the old tug at your ankles. "Mend my life," each voice cried, but you didn't stop. Mary Oliver was born in 1935 in Maple Heights, Ohio, and would evolve into one of America's most read and well-known voices in modern poetry. Oliver found solace in solitude from a young age and grew up in a dysfunctional family environment, so spent much of her youth in the woods surrounding her home. She spent many hours alone observing nature, and those hours formed the base of her writing life. When developing her craft, Mary drew upon the works of poets such as Walt Whitman and Henry David Thoreau, and chose to write with a clarity and sincerity that allowed readers to interpret their emotions, rather than through abstract literary devices. Her first two collections of poetry were No Voyage and Other Poems from 1963 and American Primitive from 1983, for which she received the Pulitzer Prize. Many critics and readers praised Mary for using direct language and providing imagery and tone that are accessible to everyone. Although many of her poems begin with descriptions of nature, they always lead to broader discussions of morality, emotion, and existentialism. The Journey, a poem included in her 1986 collection, Dreamwork, can be seen as the point in Oliver's writing when she begins to focus more on the internal lives of individuals and explores the topics of identity, autonomy, and freedom to create one's own path outside of societal expectations. Unlike her previous poetry that focused on describing what she observed in the world around her, in The Journey, she uses the world as a means to enter the most intimate subject matter she writes about. When an individual chooses to listen to their own voice, and therefore choose to preserve their own life. Dreamwork was a significant departure in the way Oliver wrote compared to her prior collections of poetry. This was the first time she wrote in a more open and personal manner, within the context of Dreamwork and its exploration of trauma, memory, autonomy, and the cost of preserving oneself emotionally. The Journey has emerged as one of her most frequently referenced and collected poems. As such, it transcends the literary, psychological, and even therapeutic fields, in that it represents a clear expression of personal awakening. Mary Oliver has a unique standing within both academic and popular circles, as her decisions to live for the majority of her adulthood in Provincetown, Massachusetts, away from the central locations of major literary communities, is reflective of her commitment to a life based on attentiveness and contemplation rather than professional aspiration. Some early critics dismissed her writing as lacking in complexity and too spiritual. However, as she gained popularity as a poet, her readership eventually changed the opinions of these critics. When Mary passed away in 2019, she left behind a body of writing that consisted of over 15 collections of poetry and numerous books of essays, all characterized by honesty, solitude, and a quiet form of spiritual defiance. Not only does Oliver's work endure as literature, but also because of the way in which it captures the inner lives of readers. Its attention to loneliness, self-inquiry, and the often difficult journey of becoming oneself. Those themes can be found throughout other forms of contemporary storytelling that are seen in other areas than poetry. One example of this would be Gone Home, a first-person narrative video game created by the Fulbright Company that was released in 2013 and examines the unfolding of private experiences and personal revelations as they occur within an intimate setting. The game takes place in the Pacific Northwest of America in 1995 and presents the player with the perspective of Caitlin Greenbrier, a college student who has returned home after a year away. Upon Caitlin's arrival at the house, it becomes apparent that the house is empty. However, what unfolds is a quiet, atmospheric, investigative experience where players can piece together the events of the past year based upon objects, rooms, and written messages. While the player controls Caitlin throughout the game, the story ultimately revolves around her younger sister, Samantha, or Sam Greenbrier. It is through Sam's experience of growth, challenges, and decisions that the emotional focus of the game emerges. Environmental storytelling forms the basis for the entire gameplay of Gone Home. Players are unable to see any characters during the course of the game. Combat is not part of the gameplay, nor do there exist any traditional puzzles. Progression is instead achieved through the examination of common domestic objects, letters, notes, photographs, cassette tapes, and understanding the emotional context. The game utilizes a familiar visual language associated with haunted houses, dim hallways, unexpected thunderstorms, and extended periods of silence, while priming the player to anticipate some sort of fear or danger. However, rather than encountering a literal haunted house, the player discovers the remnants of conflict, confusion, and a discovery of self that accompany the process of growing up. The fear experienced by the player is therefore emotional rather than supernatural, derived from the intimate and the very human story of the protagonist that they discover. In essence, Gone Home is a story about discovering one's identity and a difficult process of self-discovery in a restrictive environment. Sam's narrative evolves into a story of a young person experiencing a queer coming of age, her first experience with a female partner, Lonnie, in opposition to the expectations of a conservative military family. Much of the emotional tension of the game stems from Sam attempting to create a definition of herself while being subjected to the expectations of her parents, the pressures of school and community, and their own uncertainty regarding what her future should be. The narrative culminates in a defining moment in which Sam decides to leave home, a choice presented not as rebelliousness, but as a necessity and act of honesty. Sam's decision to leave, then, is rooted in the same kind of eternal recognition that defines many coming-of-age narratives, a moment when uncertainty gives way to clarity and action becomes unavoidable. This shift in her story closely mirrors the emotional movement that opens Mary Oliver's The Journey, where the poem begins at precisely the moment when resolve finally overcomes hesitation. The opening stanza of The Journey outlines the poet's mental and emotional progression, providing a moment of clarity and insight into the speaker's decision-making process. The speaker finds out what they need to do and begins to take the first step toward that goal. Oliver starts the poem in media res, not with a description of the speaker's thought process leading up to the decision, with the speaker taking action. One day you finally knew what you had to do, and began. The line implies that the speaker was aware of the need to make a decision for some time, and the realization was made after many days, weeks, or months of being unsure about what to do. The poem then subverts the speaker's resolve, as there are voices shouting bad advice. The voices should be interpreted literally, people, and figuratively, the expectations of others and or the speaker's own self-doubt. The voices are representative of the many obstacles to change that exist within our lives and society, encouraging the speaker to continue to function within established roles. The voice in the poem shouting bad advice have a direct parallel in Sam's world. Sam's parents exemplify the traditional expectations, heterosexuality, moral absolutism, professional success, and social conservatism. Although the parents are physically absent throughout the game, their influence is present in the home. These expectations have been absorbed by Sam to such an extent that they constitute a type of internal static, competing against a growing sense of identity. The demand to mend my life in the poem parallels the idea of the pressure to conform, existing within both the game and the poem. The initial stage of self-awareness in both the poem and the game occur despite the presence of these voices, not because of them. On a symbolic level, the image of the trembling house in Oliver's poem represents the collapse of familiar comfort, and the sense of instability that occurs when a person is moving away from an inherited identity. A house is much more than just a physical place. Houses represent family, obligations, memories, and the roles a person is expected to assume. By stating that the house began to tremble, Oliver is illustrating that a person's transformation will affect the solidity in the structures of familiarity. Something that seemed stable is now uncertain. In Gone Home, the house functions literally as a representation of the trembling that exists among the Greenbrier family. As Katie navigates the darkened rooms of the house, she comes across concrete representations of emotional distress, unopened letters, torn papers, closed off or locked rooms, and items that indicate there are underlying conflicts in the family. The tension in the parents' Yan and Terry's relationship stems from their professional failures, lack of communication, and unresolved resentment. Terry Greenbrier's preoccupation with his lost writing career and the hidden trauma from his past illustrates a man caught in a cycle of expectation and disappointment. The house contains not ghosts but absences, the things that were not said, the things that were avoided, and the fears that inform the actions of every member of the family. The game's ominous storm clouds and eerie soundscape heightens the feeling of instability, signifying that the house seems unstable because people living inside of it are unstable. As Katie makes her way through the house, she transforms into a witness rather than an actor. She cannot alter the events that transpired, instead she recreates them piece by piece. In doing so, the player becomes a participant in a complementary journey. A journey based on comprehension rather than intercession. The house functions as a metaphorical structure that must ultimately be abandoned before the truth can be discovered. Sam's absence at the conclusion of the game signifies that she has arrived at the point at which the house is unable to confine her, and the journey must proceed independently. You knew what you had to do. The wind pried with its stiff fingers. The very foundations. The melancholy was terrible. It was already late enough, and a wild night, and the road full of fallen branches and stones. This section asks the speaker's challenges by pointing out the ways in which internal and external pressures grow as change approaches. The wind is a force that is cold and insistent, and is described as having stiff fingers that pry at the very foundations. While the image of the wind is clearly meteorological, the wind serves as a metaphor for social, familiar and psychological pressures that have the potential to stabilize an individual at their very core. The foundations that the wind is attempting to pry away from are not just the walls of a house. These are the fundamental structures upon which an individual forms their sense of self, identity, relationships, and long-held values and beliefs. Oliver's description of the speaker's melancholy as terrible captures the emotional weight of the resistance or winds the speaker is encountering. The sadness of those opposing the change creates a powerful deterrent, serving as both a source of guilt and a reminder of what the speaker is expected to retain. Sam's parents do not appear to be malevolent. However, they are heavily invested in a version of Sam's life that does not allow her to express her true identity. They are sad and confused and therefore represent a type of emotional gravitational pull. This is a legitimate emotion, however it is also restrictive, and Sam must find a way to move forward through a world where love and sadness can serve as mechanisms to limit one's ability to become themselves. It was already late enough, signifying more than just the hour of the day. It can also symbolize late recognition, or the exact moment when the person realizes they cannot delay a critical decisions any longer. The late aspect of this, for Sam, is psychological and represents a feeling of urgency that if she doesn't take action now, she will lose a core component of who she is. But little by little, as she left their voices behind, the stars began to burn to the sheets of clouds. There was a new voice, which you slowly recognized as your own, that kept you company as you strode deeper and deeper into the world, determined to do the only thing you could do, determined to save the only life you could save. The journey's last stanza evolves from a confinement to release, and from confusion to understanding, as the writer progresses toward an evolving reality. Little by little, Oliver's vocabulary changes from imagery of pressure and chaos to images of enlightenment and acknowledgement. The stars started to burn to the layers of clouds. It's a moment when clarity is possible. It is not victory but visibility, a step-by-step realization of your voice and direction. Sam's emotional development mirrors the author's development in Gone Home and ends in The Attic, the last and most important story space, where her decision is no longer inferred but clearly stated. The attic is the most secluded and symbolic area of the Greenbrier house. It serves as a hiding place and viewpoint, separate from the rest of the family, while containing the truth that makes the whole story coherent. Here is where Sam expresses her most intimate feelings, clearly and without ambiguity. By reading the last of Sam's journal entries, players learn that she has decided to go with Lonnie and reject the expectations of her parents and the restrictions of her surroundings. The poem concludes with a line often cited in discussions of recovery, self-discovery and personal empowerment. Determined to save the only life you could save. This line reframes the journey not as a selfish endeavor, but as a moral one. It implies that recognizing one's limitations is essential to living truthfully. Instead of encountering a tragic ending as players were prepared to do with the game's atmospheric build-up, players experience a moment of earned optimism. The empty house that previously created tension and apprehension transforms into a transitional space. What was originally perceived as a lead-up to a threat now demonstrates the progress of a transformation that had already begun. The final gesture of both The Journey and Gone Home is one of freedom. While neither promises safety, certainty, nor permanent bliss, both assert that choosing one's own life, regardless of the uncertainty that creates, is an absolute necessity. In many ways, my mind wanders to The Journey and Gone Home when I'm thinking about those moments of quiet transition within our lives where we aren't aware that we've passed an intersection until later. We usually do not have to choose to stay or run in a moment of great drama. Instead, we live under the weight of gradual pressure to be the version of ourselves others expect us to be. Eventually, however, there will be a day when we realize something has shifted in us. The decision that has been growing quietly in the back of our minds will ask to be made. This could be deciding to leave a job that is draining us, or leaving a relationship that doesn't feel like home anymore. It could be simply to tell the truth about who we are, or this may be to admit that the burden we've carried for so long is too much for us to carry anymore. Each of these decisions come with fear, with guilt, with the feeling that we are letting someone down, or that we are entering a kind of dark space. However, for a reason, Mary Oliver's line haunts us: you can only save the life you can save. As we age, the reality and difficulty of this becomes more apparent. Being able to listen to yourself can be one of the most difficult things to do, especially when the world around us is set up to discourage that. You're meant to function efficiently and not to disrupt and offend. And this is why Sam's story sticks, not because of how dramatic it was, but because it seems familiar. I believe that many of us have been Sam at some point before, facing a choice that feels insurmountable, but ultimately recognizing that the cost of not making that choice is worse than the choice itself. But I believe that many of us have been Caitlyn as well at some point, arriving late to another person's battle and trying to understand a decision we did not see, and wishing we would have known sooner. As it usually does, life gives us few if any conclusions with clarity. Rather, it provides us with hallways, partially open doors, and remnants of our previous choices. However, both of these two pieces of work teach us as being ourselves. These are single, brilliant moments. The fact is, no one returns home as the same individual they were when they left, and sometimes returning home means leaving behind the very place that we began. And if there's any lesson we can take away, perhaps it's this: you will not learn your true self at the end of a long road. You will create your life as you go, with each honest step, little by little, as the stars begin to burn to sheets of clouds.